By 2025, Adolf Hitler's direct bloodline is officially extinct. There are no known biological children or legitimate grandchildren of the German dictator. However, there are collateral descendants born to his half-brother Adolf Hitler Jr., including his nephew William Patrick Hitler, who emigrated to the United States and served in the Navy during World War II. William had 4 sons, all of whom adopted the surname Stuart Houston and lived on Long Island, New York. According to various reports, these men made a silent pact to have no offspring, seeking to end the family name and prevent the Führer's legacy from continuing. On the other hand, Paula Hitler, Adolf's younger sister, was the last close relative who maintained family contact with him until the final days of the Third Reich. She died in 1960 without any known children or heirs. Thus, between family pacts, voluntary anonymity, and extinct lines, the Hitler surname has disappeared from the modern genealogical map, leaving only a historical shadow behind. The Wolf's sister, Paula Wolf, Hitler's younger sister who survived the war. Adolf Hitler became German Führer after the death of President Paul von Hindenburg on August 2, 1934, and merged the deceased's duties with his own as Reich Chancellor. His sister Paula was in her Vienna apartment and heard about it from the radio. More than a decade later, interrogated by the Allies after the Nazi defeat, she would confess that she was not pleased and give her reasons. "I must honestly confess that I would have preferred him to follow his original ambition and become a painter," said Paula Hitler, the Führer's only sister. She recounted that between 1929 and 1941 she saw him barely once a year and that she never met him again after that. Furthermore, she claimed her older brother's rise to power had brought her more problems than benefits. For example, she explained, in 1930 she had been fired from her job as a secretary at a Viennese insurance company simply for being a relative of the leader of the National Socialist Party. In any case, from then until his death, Adolf had supported her with a monthly stipend that first amounted to 250 and then 500 marks. According to some sources, Hitler's only remaining sister was unaware of her brother's crimes, while others maintain that it was impossible for her not to have been aware of the extermination of Jews and dissidents. There is also debate about her assets and how she acquired them during the Nazi era. Paula always claimed to have lived a frugal life, but there are investigations that attribute at least 2 properties to her, one of them of unattainable value for the average person. 89 years after Adolf Hitler achieved the amassment of power in Germany, the true story of her sister Paula, who later became known as Paula Wolf, remains an unsolved mystery. Paula Hitler was born on January 21, 1896, in the small farming community of Hafeld, Austria. She was the youngest of 6 children born to Alois Hitler and his third wife, Clara. Furthermore, Paula and Adolf were the only ones of these 6 siblings to reach adulthood. She was 7 years younger than Adolf, and when she was born, her mother was 36 and her father was over 60. "My parents were very happy despite having very different personalities. She was very affectionate. My father was harsher, especially with Adolf. They didn't get along at all. My father even hit him," Paula recounted in the only interview she gave throughout her life. When Paula was 6, Alois died on January 3, 1903, and her mother took care of the family, who moved to a modest apartment in Linz, Austria. For several years they survived on Alois's pension. Clara decided not to work to dedicate her life to her children, but 5 years after her husband's death, she was diagnosed with incurable breast cancer and died at 47. Paula was 11, and Adolf was about to turn 18. Her older brother was suffering from artistic aspirations that he couldn't fulfill there. So while Paula remained in the care of relatives, he moved to Vienna. They would go 13 years without seeing each other, barely exchanging letters. Paula claims that when Adolf wrote to her, it was to recommend books. Once he sent her a German-language volume of Cervantes's Don Quixote because he thought she would like it. However, their relationship worsened in 1908, when Paula wrote him a letter asking him not to join the army. In response, Adolf cut off communication for more than a decade, resuming it only when his sister was already 25 years old. "He stopped writing to me, and I only saw him again 13 years later in Vienna, where I moved. He told me he had gone to live in Munich, pursuing his dream of becoming a painter. He told me about his experiences during the war, his comrades, his injuries. And he gave me gifts, which, for me, who lived very modestly, was a luxury. He was already the leader of the National Socialist Party. I was happy that he was doing well. Then he returned to Munich and I stayed in Vienna earning a living as a secretary in a small office, recounted Paula, who during that time worked as a housekeeper, cleaning a military hospital, in a Jewish lodging house, and finally got a job at an insurance company. According to Paula, Adolf's political career quickly took a toll on her. Because she was the sister of the rising National Socialist leader, she was fired from her job. She defended herself by saying that politics interested her and that although she was Hitler's sister, she was not affiliated with the Nazi Party. She was fired anyway. She then asked Adolf for help. Given the difficulties I was experiencing, I went to Munich to talk to my brother. He promised to take care of me, and until his death I received 500 marks a month and 3,000 at Christmas, she said in an interview. Perhaps out of genuine concern for Paula, or perhaps to protect his political enemies, in 1936, when Hitler was already at the height of power, he suggested that she change her name and that he would arrange for her papers himself. He suggested that he adopt the surname Wolf, meaning wolf, and it was not a whimsical choice. The Nazi leader believed in the power of man to transform into wolves, and his preference for that word would be clearly seen during the war. His first barracks on the Eastern Front was called Wolfschaze, the Wolf's Lair. In Belgium, he used the codename Wolfschlucht, the Wolf Ravine, and in Ukraine he created the Werwolf Unit, the Werewolves. Paula accepted, but on the condition that she kept her given name and presented herself as Frau Wolf, as if it were her married name, so as not to attract attention among her acquaintances with the change. She soon received a passport issued in the name Paula Wolf, but with an incorrect date of birth, as she was listed as having been born on November 12, 1896, when in fact she had been born in January of that year. By the time she received her new name, Paula had been in a relationship for 2 years, not with a man named Wolf, but with the Viennese psychiatrist and neurologist Erwin Jekelius. It was this relationship that after the war led to suspicions that Paula Hitler was not as innocent as she claimed, and that she was aware of the crimes of the Holocaust. Hitler's sister claimed until her death that she met Erwin Jekelius through social connections that were completely outside the realm of the Nazis. But the truth is that after his relationship with Paula, the psychiatrist's career took off. After the outbreak of war, Jekelius enlisted in the Wehrmacht, the German army, and in 1940 was appointed director of a unit that cared, in true Nazi fashion, for mentally disabled children. From there, he was responsible for the deaths of more than 4,000 disabled people. For some reason, the doctor lost Hitler's trust, and he soon after sent him to the Eastern Front, where he was captured by the Soviets. Another fact that aroused suspicion about Paula was her assets. By the end of the war, she owned a luxuriously restored villa in Weiten-Wachau and an apartment in Vienna. After the fall of Germany, both properties were confiscated, one by the Soviets and the other by the Americans, and were never returned to her. The documentation identifying her as Paula Wolf was of no use to Hitler's sister in escaping the Allies. While detained, she was interrogated twice by American intelligence officers on July 15, 1945, and June 5 of the following year. In one of them, she not only stated that she knew nothing about the Holocaust, but that she did not believe her brother had ordered it. "I don't believe my brother ordered the crimes committed against countless human beings in the concentration camps, or that he even knew about them. However, it's possible that the harsh years of his youth may have provoked an anti-Jewish attitude. He was starving in Vienna, and believed his failure in painting was due to the fact that the art trade was in Jewish hands," Paula said, in a vain attempt to defend her brother's memory. She also lamented Adolf's death. "My brother's personal fate affected me greatly. He was still my brother no matter what happened. His death caused me indescribable pain," she stated, and according to a note from the interrogating officer, she had to interrupt the interview because she burst into unstoppable tears. Despite her suspicions, Paula was eventually released and returned to Vienna, where she survived with the help of some friends until she found work in an art gallery. In December 1952, she moved to Berchtesgaden, where she lived in a small 2-room apartment, and then to Hamburg, where she died on June 1, 1960, leaving no descendants. Paula Hitler, under the name Paula Wolf, was buried in the Bergfriedhof Cemetery, But her grave no longer exists. Her remains were recovered in 2005 and her fate is unknown. The Illegitimate Child, the incredible story of Jean-Marie Laurey, Hitler's alleged son, and his family. One day in 1914, a group of French peasant women were carrying out their usual straw-gathering tasks on the side of a road when they noticed across the road a young German soldier watching them while they were enjoying a day of rest in the area of Fournes-en-Vespe, near the northern city of Lille, France. Curious, the peasant women decided that one of them should approach the soldier to find out who he was. The chosen one was named Charlotte Lobjoie, 16 years old. The young soldier's name was Adolf Hitler, who, with his papers and pencils in hand, given his passion for drawing and painting, as he still aspired to become a renowned painter in Vienna, had managed to obtain permission to rest away from the front lines while the Germans fought the French in Picardy during the Great War. This closeness led to a romantic relationship which, according to some rumors, culminated in the birth of a son. Jean-Marie, the child in question, was born between March 18th and 25th, 1918, in Seboncourt, in the Picardy region of France, where the young 28-year-old Adolf had been stationed. Over the years, he not only became an almost anonymous railway worker, but suddenly became known as Hitler's son, clamoring for the recognition of his supposed father's surname for years. According to him, from birth, Jean-Marie was rejected by his father and his classmates, who called him a dirty German. His mother, Charlotte, one day gave him up to a foster family who, strangely enough, settled in a comfortable apartment in Frankfurt, Germany, during the 1920s, without even investing a cent in it. Those who support Jean-Marie's legitimacy claim that Adolf Hitler received news from his son from time to time, but the bond between father and son was never consummated, nor did they ever meet in person. Jean-Marie himself has told the press that one day his mother told him, "Your father was Hitler," and from then on Jean-Marie Laurey, using his adopted surname, began a crusade to finally be recognized as the son of the Nazi Führer without hesitation and without the slightest intention of hiding it. Jean-Marie Laurey's obsession with proving himself Hitler's unrecognized son led him to a frantic search, which included interrogating contemporary witnesses and conducting comparative physiognomy and blood studies at the Institute of Anthropology and Genetics at the University of Heidelberg. On the one hand, it's important to highlight the remarkable physical resemblance. Jean-Marie Laurey was seen posing in newspapers more than once, his moustache trimmed similarly to that of the Nazi leader. They did indeed look like the same person, although the French boy was larger than his supposed father. However, scientific studies weren't entirely conclusive. The DNA laboratory determined that Adolf Hitler and Jean-Marie Laurey shared the same blood type, but couldn't prove that he was their son. Finally, he also requested graphological analysis, and everything seemed to support his claim, so he knocked on Françoise's studio door. Gibault, a Paris lawyer, and upon being received, said what he should say: "I am the son of Adolf Hitler. Tell me, what should I do?" When his mother died, Jean-Marie Laurey noticed that the house contained original paintings signed by Hitler himself. Although Laurette lived through the Second World War fighting the Nazis in France and becoming the agent Clément as part of the French resistance, in his later adulthood he seemed obsessed with being recognized as the Führer's son. Some believe he was after money, as he had inquired about the royalties from Mein Kampf, which other descendants had renounced. He also claimed possession of the paintings in his mother's apartment, which have no artistic value, as Hitler was a terrible painter, but acquired value as historical curiosities coveted by morbid collectors of Nazi memorabilia. Despite his struggle, it was never proven that he was the legitimate son of the Führer, and he did not enjoy that legal status. Laurey died in 1985 in the city of Saint-Quentin, France. The mystery surrounding his true identity still hangs in the air, and it is his son, Philippe Laurette, who persists in the search. When Jean-Marie died, the story of Hitler's alleged son was forgotten, but a few decades later it resurfaced at the hands of Philippe Laurette, Jean-Marie's son and Hitler's alleged grandson, who decided to rekindle the controversy by trying to provide new evidence that sought to confirm the relationship. However, this evidence left many doubts and remained only clues, not proof. In statements to the English newspaper Daily Mail, Philippe recounted how in 1985 he traveled to Munich and met the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, the macabre head of the SS and coordinator of the mass extermination of the Jewish people. According to his testimony, the woman believed in him because she had heard about a French son of Hitler. Added to this is a certain anecdote that in reality confirms nothing. After the death of his maternal grandparents, little Jean-Marie was adopted by a wealthy French family, thanks to a German nun who was supposedly a friend of Adolf Hitler. He also mentions the strange case of the enormous building in Frankfurt that Jean-Marie's adoptive family received free of charge, which Philippe never inherited, as the building was sold and the proceeds used to pay for young Lauret's education. Philippe has insisted in front of the press that he is not proud of his claimed connection to Hitler. However, his apartment in Saint-Quentin in northern France is decorated with portraits of the Führer. "I believe I am Hitler's grandson. Of course I am. The evidence is there. If people don't believe it, that's their problem. My father told me so. My mother is still alive and believes it too. He's part of my family, that's why I have him on the wall," the French plumber said, adding, "Hitler is my family. I'm not guilty of all the things that happened during the war. What he did has nothing to do with me, but he will always be my family member." He also denies believing in the concept of an evil gene and is not worried about the future of his children or grandchildren. He believes his family has nothing to do with the events of World War II and the Holocaust. "We weren't there when all this happened." However, in subsequent interviews, Philippe defended Hitler's legacy, asserting that he had been a good leader, but that he was surrounded by bad people. Regarding this, he said, "Maybe the people around him manipulated him to do all these unpleasant things. Maybe he wasn't even aware that these kinds of unpleasant things were happening." The truth is that, following these statements, the French press decided to stop giving him a voice, considering it a regrettable, unnecessary, and totally reprehensible defense of one of the greatest monsters humanity has ever known. This truncated the Lauret's search for the truth, as they not only ceased to be interesting subjects for the French public, but were also pushed into oblivion. While it is known that Philippe had a family, his children have preferred anonymity and, to date, have not sought to pursue the family genealogy linking the Laurets to Adolf Hitler. Infiltrated in royalty, the possible secret son between Hitler and the young British woman Unity Mitford. Unity Mitford, a young British aristocrat, left a controversial legacy by becoming one of the foreign figures closest to Adolf Hitler. Her fascination with the Nazi leader led her to live in Munich and enter his inner circle. She also recorded her experiences in a personal diary. The diary, which spans from 1935 to 1939, details her encounters and intimate experiences which place her as the German dictator's girlfriend. In 1933, when she was just 18 years old, Unity attended a Hitler rally in Nuremberg for the first time with her sister Diana, wife of Oswald Mosley, leader of British fascism. This event marked the beginning of her obsession with the Führer to the point of devising a plan to meet him. In 1934, she convinced her parents, Lord and Lady Redesdale, to move to Munich under the pretext of learning German. Once in Germany, Unity frequented the Osteria Bavaria restaurant for months, a place Hitler regularly visited. She would always sit in the same place to get his attention, even dropping books or talking loudly. Finally, after 8 months of waiting, the Führer noticed her presence and they began to develop a relationship. On Monday, February 18th of that year, they had one of their first close encounters. The Führer invited her to his table and they chatted for 2 hours. The young woman wrote about Hitler. "He speaks beautifully. He invites me to visit him in Berlin if I go and compliments me on my German." Unity not only became close to Hitler, but also became a frequent visitor to his inner circle. Her personal diary records a total of 139 meetings with the Führer, some of them private. As their relationship progressed, she also interacted with key figures of the Nazi regime, such as the architect Albert Speer. Speer noted, according to the outlet, that no other foreigner had become as close to Hitler as Unity. Her closeness generated rumors about a possible role as a British spy. According to statements collected in David Price Jones's biography, an SS officer who knew Unity claimed that Erich Widmann, a member of the SS and Unity's suitor, had been ordered to keep an eye on her. However, according to this same source, Widmann soon developed personal feelings towards her. Her fascination aroused suspicion, but nothing was ever proven. Meanwhile, she was increasingly meeting with him and his circle. By this time, the girl was already hopelessly in love. In her diary, she recorded, "The Führer arrives at 2:10 p.m. and leaves at 3:15 p.m. He says goodbye to me. He turns around 3 times to look at me and then back at his car, sadly, unsmiling. I feel miserable. I go home. I cry myself to sleep." As the months passed, they continued to see each other and seemed likely to flirt, but by all accounts they never established anything but a platonic relationship. In 1939, after the outbreak of World War II, Unity attempted to leave Germany. Apparently, she had been invited to leave the country, and she couldn't bear to be away from Hitler. Although she survived, she was permanently damaged and returned to England, where she lived in seclusion, never seeing Hitler again until his death in 1948. While the official romance ended there, there is a deeper story behind it. Some British intelligence sources suspected that Unity Mitford and Hitler had secretly fathered a child. After Mitford's suicide attempt and her return to the United Kingdom, Unity spent time at Hillview Cottage, a private maternity hospital in Oxfordshire. As early as 1939, this raised many suspicions, and many developed the theory that Hitler and Mitford had a much closer relationship than previously believed and that Mitford was in fact pregnant. It is believed that this may have also motivated her profound emotional and psychological instability, since the girl was deeply in love with the Führer much older than her and that she did not see that love reciprocated. The possibility of carrying a child could have triggered a psychological crisis that led to depression, coupled with the hormonal changes that are normal during pregnancy. What remains unclear, and hence the suspicions, is whether or not Unity actually bore Hitler's child. Journalist Martin Bright, contacted regarding this theory after publishing a previous article on Mitford, investigated the hypothesis of the girl's possible maternity. During his work, Bright discovered that Hillview Cottage was used as a maternity ward during World War II, and that Mitford's presence was a constant rumour throughout the village due to the girl's belonging to the British aristocracy. A review of birth records at the Oxfordshire Registry Office also matched Bright's claims about the maternity ward, including that it had been run by her Aunt Betty Norton, but there was no record that Mitford had ever been there. Lack of records at the maternity ward was common, as the officials there later admitted, as the war and post-war periods were very turbulent. Many mothers gave up their children because they had lost their husbands in the conflict or simply feared poverty. Bright later contacted Deborah Mitford, Unity's sister, who was the last of the Mitford siblings still alive at the time. Deborah dismissed the Hitler baby theory as the result of village gossip, but confirmed that Unity had been staying at the maternity hospital to recover from a mental breakdown. Upon consulting the National Archives, Bright also found a file on Unity sealed under the 100-year rule, which prohibited the file from being opened for 100 years from its creation. However, the journalist was given special permission to open it and discovered that in October 1941, Unity Mitford had been having a relationship with a married RAF test pilot, which Bright argued was compelling evidence that Unity might not have been as disabled as previously assumed. But Bright's research also opened up other avenues of inquiry, and several historians, television channels, and documentary filmmakers began to put forward their own hypotheses or theories. Overall, the outcome was always based on rumour and speculation. Although British television revealed that MI5, the British Secret Security Service, wanted to interrogate Mitford upon her return to Britain, and only thanks to the intervention of Home Secretary Sir John Anderson did they do so. A note in the Evening Standard newspaper read about this theory. Unity would have been delighted to have Hitler's child, preferably within marriage. She never made any secret of her desire to marry the Führer. Unlike Lauret, Hitler's supposed illegitimate French son, the identity of this supposed child or even its existence remains unknown and is almost impossible to prove. For this reason, many historians and those who personally knew Mitford have dismissed the accusation. If it did exist, it would have been put up for adoption after birth to an anonymous and untraceable British home. Close family: William Patrick Hitler, the nephew hated by the Führer and the secret pact of his children. Adolf Hitler's family history has always been a subject of much debate, not least because the Führer himself could not prove he had no Jewish ancestry, as the origins of his paternal grandfather were unknown. This, of course, went against the law Hitler himself had imposed on members of the Nazi Party, as well as on his officers and soldiers. In addition to his brother and father, both named Alois, who were hardened alcoholics and violent, involved in more than one scandal, other members of the Führer's family tree are worth mentioning. Such is the case of William Patrick Hitler, nephew of the National Socialist leader with whom he forged a deep enmity to the point that he enlisted in the Allied ranks to fight against his uncle's forces. Although he lived only a short time in Nazi Germany, where he enjoyed a comfortable life due to his surname, he decided to return to the United Kingdom for fear that the Führer would attempt on his life, as the young man claimed to know a dark secret about Adolf Hitler's identity. In 1944, a young American Navy recruit was waiting to be drafted into the service with other volunteers. While in line, an officer approached him and asked, "Name?" The boy replied, "Hitler." The officer smiled and mockingly replied, "A pleasure, Mr. Hitler. My name is Hess." Of course, the sailor would be enormously surprised to discover that this wasn't a joke, but that the young man in front of him was William Patrick Hitler, the German Führer's nephew. But what led William to enlist in the American Navy to fight against his own uncle's forces? This story begins in Dublin when Alois Hitler, Adolf's half-brother, met Bridget Dowling in 1909. The two fell in love, and 2 years later their son, William Patrick Hitler, was born. He was known as Billy in Liverpool, where he grew up. According to Bridget's own accounts, Adolf moved with his family to Liverpool between November 1912 and April 1913, although these claims have been dismissed by most historians. By 1914, Alois had become an alcoholic and violent man, which led to his relationship with Bridget reaching a disastrous point. He left his family to return to Germany. William was thus raised by his mother until 1933, when, at the age of 21, he traveled to his father's homeland to try to reconnect with Alois. In Germany, William met his father's new family, who had fathered a new son, Heinz Hitler. Unlike William, Heinz became a staunch National Socialist, fighting for his uncle Adolf until he died in 1942 as a prisoner of war in the Soviet Union. Although he never managed to reconnect with his father, William took advantage of his uncle's power, having recently become Chancellor, to get a fairly comfortable job at a bank in Berlin. He also found other jobs, mainly as a car salesman, but in any case, William couldn't seem to settle in the country. One of the reasons was the constant harassment from his uncle Adolf, who, for example, forbade him from sending money to his mother, who still lived in Liverpool. Although his surname brought him a certain fame wherever he went, one day everything changed. While working at the Opel automobile factory, William was suddenly fired. He was given no reason, but later learned that the Führer kept spies close to him, who reported to him about his nephew's behavior that they considered inappropriate. The relationship between William and Adolf only worsened. The young Briton disagreed with the policies of the Third Reich, and he felt a particular aversion to fascism and anti-Semitism. When Adolf Hitler asked his nephew to renounce his English citizenship, the young man suspected it was a setup to assassinate him without raising suspicions in the United Kingdom. At this point, William did something that in retrospect might seem crazy. He blackmailed the Führer, threatening to reveal that his grandfather's origins might be Jewish, a fact that was rumored within the Hitler family. After this risky act, which went unnoticed, William returned to Liverpool with his mother. In 1939, a few years after the outbreak of the war, the two participated in a tour of the United States, where they discussed the Führer's private life. He also published an article in Look magazine entitled "Why I Hate My Uncle," in which he mentioned his uncomfortable stay in Germany and emphatically pointed out the Nazis' hatred for anything that didn't fit their worldview. Hitler, in turn, deepened his hatred for his nephew, since the boy's telling his version of events humanized the Führer, who ultimately sought to build a myth about himself. The idea of the almost deified Aryan hero that Adolf sought contrasted with the version of a young man who recounted events that showed the German leader as an ordinary man, incapable even of hiding his own family secrets. According to William, before leaving Germany, the Führer threatened to kill him, stating that something bad would happen to both him and his mother if he continued to claim they were blood relatives. After the Battle of Britain, William and his mother were stranded in the United States, and by 1944 the boy had made a decisive decision. He made a special request to volunteer for the US Navy, which was granted by President Roosevelt himself. Later, it would be learned that accepting William into the Navy was not an easy proposition, as the FBI was considering the possibility that he might, despite everything, be a Nazi spy. Because of this, Roosevelt met with the director of the agency, J. Edgar Hoover, to consider the request. Ultimately, they both agreed that there would be no problem, as long as the boy was not assigned to duties of sensitive value to the United States. Thus, William joined the Navy as a pharmacy assistant and later served in the Navy as part of the medical staff on the battlefield. After the fall of Berlin and the end of the war, William continued serving until 1947, when he was discharged after being wounded in battle and receiving a Purple Heart. William later changed his surname from Hitler to Stuart Houston, married a German woman, and together they lived in the United States in complete anonymity. William set up his own laboratory where he performed blood tests and continued his profession as a pharmacist, just as he had done when he joined the army. The couple had 4 sons, Alexander, Louis, Howard, and Brian. These are known as Hitler's great nephews. However, they consistently shunned public life, and their lives have always remained a mystery. No wonder. Bearing the blood of humanity's most infamous genocidaire isn't for everyone. In fact, William Patrick decided to change his surname from Hitler to Stuart Houston to distance his heirs from the Nazi legacy. For decades, historians, journalists, and researchers pursued William Patrick's heirs, but they managed to maintain their privacy, at least until a journalist managed to track down Alexander, the only one who decided to break the silence. Gardner, the journalist, began his investigation after a source close to the family told him that Hitler's great-nephews had made a pact not to have children so as not to continue spreading the Führer's blood. The idea that evil was a genetic issue seemed fascinating to Gardner, and he went to great lengths to interview one of William Patrick's children. Alex has always lived anonymously under a name that bears no resemblance to his great-uncle's sinister past. Apparently, nothing connects him to Adolf Hitler, and he doesn't want it to. However, Alexander Stuart Houston, 68, was located by a journalistic team in a small town called Patchogue on Long Island. He is the eldest of the Nazi genocidaire's descendants. When he was born, his parents chose Adolf as his middle name, but today it does not appear on their documents. In order to speak with Alex, the journalist did not begin the interview by talking about the Führer, but instead told him he wanted to discuss contemporary German politics, to which Hitler's great-nephew accepted. On the front porch of his home, Alexander finally agreed, after decades of absolute silence, to discuss his thoughts. His brothers, Brian and Louis, live a few doors down, but they don't want to talk to the press. Howard, the youngest, died in an accident. The interview was brief, and he said he liked Angela Merkel, the German chancellor at the time. He thought she was an intelligent and kind person, and that he had her personal support. He also went on to question US President Donald Trump, whom he called a liar. When asked if he liked Trump's leadership style, he replied, "He's the last person I'd say I admire. He's definitely not one of my favorites. I don't like liars." Alexander never responded to the alleged pact between his brothers to end Hitler's legacy, although he married, he had no children, and no records show that his brothers ever had families. Hitler's great-nephews boast neither honor nor great dishonor in their own history, but they chose sacrifice. This choice, however, has not been easy. Living with the decision not to continue the family, to not have the possibility of redeeming themselves through future generations, has been another burden these descendants have had to bear. Despite this, they have maintained their commitment, seeing it as the only way to free themselves from Hitler's shadow. Family betrayal: Leo Raubals Jr., Hitler's nephew who loved his uncle and was betrayed by him. However, not all of the Führer's nephews were as rebellious as William Patrick. Closer to his ideology was another of Hitler's relatives, the son of his half-sister Angela Raubal, a young man named Leo Rudolf Raubal Jr. Leo, despite being a member of the Nazi Party since 1932, maintained a distant relationship with politics. However, his uncle Adolf considered him his favorite nephew and often spent time with him. Shortly after the outbreak of World War II, 32-year-old Leo, a steel plant manager in the Austrian city of Linz, was drafted into the army and joined the Luftwaffe as a lieutenant in the engineering corps. In 1941, he was among the millions of soldiers sent to the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. By late 1942, Raubal was in Stalingrad with the Sixth Army, separated from the main German forces. His commander, Friedrich Paulus, suggested that Leo, after being wounded, be airlifted home. Hitler, however, refused, stating that although he was his nephew, he was an officer in the German army and should therefore remain with his men. On January 23, 1943, Leo Raubal was captured by Soviet troops. At first, nothing was known about his family ties. It was Leo himself who first expressed this, and his words were corroborated by other captured officers. Lieutenant Raubal was taken to Moscow for interrogation. There, he provided detailed information about his uncle's relatives, habits, daily routine, and interests, including information about Hitler's inner circle, highlighting the degree of influence each had over the Führer. This information proved very useful after the war, when some of them were captured by the Soviet Union. Through intermediaries, Hitler offered to exchange his beloved nephew for artillery battery commander Yakov Djugashvili, Joseph Stalin's son, who had been in German captivity since July 1941. The Soviet leader flatly refused. In 1949, despite no evidence of guilt, Leo Raubal was convicted as a war criminal and sentenced to 25 years in the Gulag, the Soviet Union's forced labor camp, for supporting Hitler's aggressive and criminal policies and for his participation in the crimes of the Sixth Army on Soviet soil. In 1955, at the request of West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, thousands of German war criminals were released from Soviet captivity. Among them was Raubal. He returned to his native Linz, where he worked as a chemistry teacher until his death in 1977. However, Leo Rudolf Raubal Jr. had a son, Peter Raubal, born in 1931, who decided to completely distance himself from his genealogical line and lived in anonymity throughout his life. Peter graduated as an engineer and worked in the profession, keeping a low profile and away from the media. Although it is believed that he is still alive today, over 94 years old, the truth is that Peter decided not to have children, as would the rest of the Führer's great-nephews, a symbolic way of ending a genealogical line which took on an unrelated responsibility, to eliminate any trace that his great-uncle could leave on this earth. The monster. Between the sheets, Geli Raubal, Hitler's niece who may have been murdered by her uncle. Geli Raubal was the daughter of Angela Hitler, Adolf's paternal sister. She worked as a housekeeper in Vienna and was widowed at a young age, raising several children. The youngest, Geli, was 2 years old. When her brother's political career began to take off, he brought her to Munich and hired her as his housekeeper, a job she retained at Hitler's Berghof, his home in the Alps as Führer. Hitler had always shown a fondness for Geli. When she turned 16, he took her to live with him. He publicly stated that he cared for his niece and wanted to provide her with a good education. She began studying medicine but soon dropped out to devote herself to singing and acting. Hitler, her uncle, hired the best teachers in all of Germany. Hitler took her to public events, they went to the theater, and they were seen eating together every night in the city's best restaurants. Those who saw them together claimed that he seemed happy in her company, that her boldness amused and embarrassed him at the same time. She had an outgoing personality, long hair, a broad smile, and lively eyes. She dressed in a style older than her age, and at 16 she was dazzled by this powerful man who provided her with attention, protection, and a living. When she turned 20, Geli had an affair with Emil Maurice, her uncle's chauffeur. When he found out, Hitler kicked the man out and restricted her every move. He began to monitor her every activity and forbid her from leaving the house alone. Years later, letters written by the young woman after the forced breakup were found in which she told Emil that they had to wait, that in 2 years everything would be different. Hitler had promised her that when she was older, she would be able to live her own life. A few years later, Hitler's personal photographer Heinrich Hoffmann testified that Hitler had told him he was in love with her and that despite his promises to remain single, he might even have married her niece. His love for her was so great that he felt obliged to watch over Geli's future. This meant that he would prevent any relationship he considered inappropriate or untimely. This was his excuse to keep suitors who might approach her away from her. During those years, Geli had other brief affairs. All of them were hidden behind her uncle's back, who, under the pretext of protecting her and keeping her away from those who might harm her, was jealous of her and devoted all his obsession to her. In other letters, addressed to her mother and friends, Geli Raubal speaks admiringly of Uncle Alf. She recounts how he took her to dinner, what their favorite activities were, and the prominent figures they frequented. No one can say for sure whether their relationship was sexual in nature, but what is undeniable to most historians and biographers who have studied the subject is that Hitler, 19 years her senior, developed an unhealthy obsession with Geli, one of oppression and control. He was simultaneously an uncle, a lover, whether physical or platonic, a provider and a captor. One of Geli's ex-boyfriends claimed that she wasn't particularly bright or refined. Whether he was motivated by spite, a need to distance himself from Nazism, or a dispassionate analysis of his past relationships is unknown. The truth is that the women Hitler associated with were of a lower class than his, didn't show much interest, were much younger, and this made them financially and socially dependent on him. In 1931, Geli was found dead under completely suspicious circumstances. The girl's death was quickly ruled self-destruction, and the police did not investigate further. A subsequent complaint forced the case to be reopened months later, but the case was taken up by a judge who, again, closed it within hours. That judge would become the first Minister of Justice of the Third Reich. No one found it strange that she had offered no clues about her upcoming decision, or that she had left a half-written letter addressed to a mysterious man speaking of the future. Nor did the nature of the relationship or her uncle's recurrent behavior toward her seem suspicious. Hitler was on the rise to power, so a personal matter like this was ignored, and almost no one wanted to discuss it. Some apocryphal historians claimed it was an incestuous relationship and that Hitler subjected her to aberrant practices, and that Geli could not bear it any longer. After Geli was found dead, Hitler suffered a deep depression, and several of his close friends feared that he would take his own life. This state lasted for a few days. Some claim that this episode, the death of Geli Raubal, caused him to lose the last vestiges of humanity he possessed, and that he ended up becoming the criminal being he ended up becoming as a Nazi leader. However, the truth is that Hitler's entire history is marked by inhumanity, power, and cruelty, and the way he treated this girl is part of the Führer's catalogue of infamous ties. The impossible escape, the theories that claim Hitler survived the war. Incredibly, the first person to reject the idea of Hitler's suicide was one of his sworn enemies, Joseph Stalin, the controversial leader of the Soviet Union. Upon being informed of the Führer's suicide, Stalin ordered the seizure of the chancellery and the recovery of the bodies to confirm death. For more than 2 years, tests were performed on the alleged remains of Hitler and Eva Braun, and the results were inconclusive. For the leader of the Communist Party, the dictator had staged a suicide attempt and had fled to Spain or Argentina, and he wasn't the only one who held this theory. During his dictatorship in Germany, Hitler had been the target of several attempts on his life, dubbed in popular culture as the Valkyrie operations. Both attempts failed. But what many researchers point out is that in one of these attacks, which appeared to be successful, the person who died was actually one of Adolf Hitler's doubles. The great dictator was protected by a corps of agents who dressed and behaved identically to him. This was presented as evidence of a possible impersonation of the leader by one of his imitators. While the United States accepted the official version of Hitler's death, Central Intelligence was cautious enough to maintain the benefit of the doubt. They never stopped monitoring the Führer's possible destinations had he escaped. The main one was Argentina. Evidence that supports this hypothesis and brings it closer to reality is that several of the most important Nazis took refuge in the South American country after the fall of Berlin. Among them is Adolf Eichmann, one of the organizers of the Jewish Holocaust, who handled the logistics for transporting victims between concentration and extermination camps. Eichmann lived in Buenos Aires for 12 years until he was kidnapped by Mossad Avengers, taken out of the country, and put on trial for his crimes against humanity. Erich Priebke, another of the great SS genocidaires, also lived in the Argentine town of Bariloche, where he was a leader of the German community. Furthermore, among the declassified CIA files leaked during the WikiLeaks phenomenon, one from 1955 reported several possible sightings of Hitler in Argentina, although no investigation was presented. The US stance of vigilance and non-involvement is not surprising, since at that time, its greatest enemy was the communists of the Soviet Union. And it was precisely the Russians who never accepted the theory of official suicide, and in 2009 they carried out tests on the supposed remains of Hitler that they had taken from the garden of the Chancellery in 1945, although the results were negative. However, a study conducted in France in 2018 on a dental sample found at the site where the Führer and his wife had been cremated was compared to an X-ray of Hitler's teeth from the 1940s. The study was positive, and researchers proclaimed it sufficient evidence to determine that the Nazi party leader had died according to the official story, although many experts in the field maintain that it is impossible to conclude all this from evidence as small as 2 teeth. While the theories are many, the most accepted story is still the suicide hypothesis. Although, according to our research, it is impossible to detail an event that occurred in the dark, in the privacy of a political leader with his wife and his trusted men. However, this same search has led to an investigation into whether Hitler had children or what happened to his offspring, and some traces have appeared where no one expected, in France.